And we welcome to noise11.com Paulie Stewart. Normally talking to you about a new Painters and Dockers album, Paulie. It's a bit different this time. Your life.
Yeah, this is
in the
yep. Finally got it out after years of sort of trying to put it together. My two sisters actually sat me down and said, "If you don't finish this book, we're going to kill you." So I got my shit together and finished it. Yeah,
We will be getting into like a lot of heartache and sorrow as we go through this, because there's
sure.
some real tragedy in your life over the decades, which
Yeah,
like it took a lot of courage to put all of that together into one book. So I thought we'd better start off with something a bit lighter. Frank Thring.
thanks, Paul. Yeah. Okay. I love Frank Thring. He's my absolute hero. I love him. And
I'm reading this Frank Thring story and I'm going, what the? This
yeah.
actually happened as you've written it, I take it.
Yeah. Frank Thring was, notorious sort of, guy. He lived in Melbourne, and he's one of the few sort of actors to make it in Hollywood. He was actually in Ben-Hur. Now, it doesn't get bigger than sort of Ben-Hur, but this guy at the Herald Sun, this photographer, would tell this story, Paul, seriously, every Friday night. He'd tell the same story. And every time I would just crack up. But it went along the lines of that they sent him around to, photograph Frank Thring one morning, for a story. And he got there with a journo, and they knocked on the door and no one answered. And they said, "Oh, where is he?" And they stayed there for half an hour, knocked on the door, nothing. So they rang back at the office and said to the editor, "Look, he's not here. We're coming back in." And the editor said, "Listen, nothing's happening. We've got a big hole in the paper. You need to get Frank. So, ring his manager and see what's happening." So they rang Frank. They rang Frank's manager, and he said, "I know he promised he'd be there." And so, "Look, let me come down." And the manager went down, and they knocked on the door, nothing. And then finally they rang the police to come around. "Look, we can't get in. Frank was supposed to be here." And the police said, "Well, Jimmy, open the door and we'll all go in." So they opened the door, all went in, and they go through Frank's house, and they got to the back room, and there, hanging suspended from the ceiling, was Frank Thring, stark naked, with clothes pegs all over his body, stuck to his body. And he had a billiard ball in his mouth and some tape, and they went, "Frank, Frank, Frank." And they got him and they let him down, and they go, "Oh, are you okay, Frank? Frank, are you okay?" And they took the mask off him, and they said, "You're right, Frank." And he said, "What a fabulous weekend." And that just cracked me up. Frank Thing is also the guy who on the Mike Walsh show, because he played Pontius Pilate in, Ben-Hur. And on the Mike Walsh show, he walked on with a tankard of rum and coke, midday television. And Mike Walsh said, "Oh, did you get to meet, the character who played Jesus?" And he said, "Met him. I was in him." Like, it just totally freaked everybody out. But I love Frank Thring.
There's so much contrast in this book, isn't there? I mean, there's highs, there's lows. It's been a real roller coaster ride that almost, we didn't get this far about 15 years ago. But, let's go back even further than that.
Well, that's right.
Yeah, the reason I'm sure you started this book was to document a lot of what happened with the family, with your brother Tony, the tragedies, the brutally honest account that you have of how this affected the family, your mother in perspective. This must have been a very difficult story for you to write.
Well, it's just sort of been my story. It's always been with me, since I was 15. My life changed forever when, I was walking home from school and I saw this newspaper banner outside a newsagents that said 5 journalists missing in East Timor. And I knew one of them was my brother. And, I found out over the next sort of week that he'd been killed up there. But I honestly thought, Paul, that would be it. I'd never talk about it again. People would move on from it. And now, almost 40 years later, there's not too many days where I don't talk about it. I go into schools and talk about it a lot, or, I've been up to East Timor now 30 times, and, I've got lots of close, really East Timorese friends, and yeah, it opened up a whole sort of world that I wasn't sort of expecting.
With the documentation of this, what surprised me was the number of very high-profile politicians who basically duck for cover instead of talking about it. We're talking about the likes of Gough Whitlam, Paul Keating, Bob Hawke. These people never really addressed what was going on, did they?
Well, they were too sort of worried about it upsetting the Indonesians, because the fact of the matter is, Indonesia's, the biggest Muslim country in the world, and it's, just an hour's flight time from Australia. So they sort of went out of their way not to upset them. But the fact is, Australia owed the East Timorese people so much from their help in the Second World War, where they helped to stop the Japanese, like in East Timor, before they invaded Australia. So I found out about all this stuff, over the years, the debt that we owed the Timorese. And I always felt, right from the word go, I felt really guilty, because people would always come up and, they'd acknowledge my grief about losing my brother there. But I was meeting Timorese people who'd lost 8 family members or 10 family members, like hundreds of thousands of Timorese were killed. And I thought, this is not fair, that the white lens only goes on these 5 white journalists when there's hundreds of thousands of local people. And this is 50 minutes flight time from Darwin.
Where it was, particularly tragic for a lot of people, these things that have happened over there. As you've said, you went over there 30 times plus yourself. That got a bit dangerous in the early days for you, didn't it?
Yeah, I got arrested a few times up there, and the first times I went up there, the Indonesians were still in charge, and there were a sort of Red Beret guys who were their elite forces all over Dili, and machine gun nests, and foreigners were very much under the microscope, and it wasn't encouraged to go there at all. So yeah, that was pretty heavy the first few times. And then I saw the whole, the liberation, the referendum vote where the locals decided they wanted independence, and that happened. But then there was a terrible civil sort of war that broke out, where the crew who was still pro-Indonesians just went on a rampage and murdered and raped and burnt everything to the ground. And that was shocking. And then, life being the wacky thing that it is, I end up there with, Kylie and John Farnham doing this show in front of all the Australian troops there, which was amazing.
Well, was the catalyst for that, I guess, because you found out about your brother when you were a school kid, and then leaving school, you became a journalist with the Herald Weekly Times and the Herald Sun, but also in a successful punk band, Painters and Dockers. So it sort of gave you a grounding for activism for later on, didn't it? You knew how to write about it. You also knew how to talk about it.
The only reason I got a job as a journalist was because, my brother, had been killed at Balibo, because my school marks were terrible. But the company that ran the Sun newspaper also ran Channel 7. And so when I went in for an interview, my mum said, whatever you do, don't forget to tell them that your brother was one of those journos. And I did the work interview, and the guys looked at me going, well, your marks are terrible, you haven't got much chance, mate. Why do you actually want to become a journalist? And I trotted out the line, oh, well, my brother did it. And this guy sort of sat bolt upright, and he said, oh, just hang on a tick. And he walked out of the room, and I went, well, I've got this gig. And he came back and said, you start next Tuesday, because the company felt guilty about it. And so I always felt as a journo a bit kind of, for years, I thought I was a fraud in there, you know. It was only about 6 years later, and you would have come across this, Paul, you know, that I ended up ringing my mum going, half these journos are full of shit. They don't know what, they think they're the captains of intellect, but they're just idiots, you know, like, you know. I actually think the best attribute a journo has, it's not a massive intellect, it's the ability to sit down with anybody and just have a conversation, you know, to get a story out of somebody. That's the main kind of attribute you need as a journo, and I was able to do that. But then, thank God, the painters and dockers came along, because I was an angry young chap, and I was pissed off about my brother, and I couldn't believe life. Everyone was just living this normal life, where I felt such an internal kind of rage, you know. And then I discovered punk rock, and it was like, oh, where have you been all my life, you know? Get up on stage and scream, shout, drop your pants, you know, drink a bottle of whiskey, and they pay you for it afterwards. It's like, hey, it got me right from the word go. Yeah.
So how were you channeled then from that first job in the Herald and Weekly Times to the music section?
Well, basically because I was not good at anything else. You know, the guys at police round said, don't send him up here. That guy's too bent. And I worked on the races for a while, but, you know, I didn't... Working at the races at a newspaper, like the race results, do not put in the wrong weight of the horse or the wrong, you know, the jockey's uniform, the wrong colour, or you will die, because people study that race form, and if you stuff it up, they will kill you, you know. And I used to, you know, what colour's the jockey's uniform? Oh, I think it was pink or something, you know, and so I wasn't real good at that. And general, you know, politics I wasn't that clever at, and it was this editor who sat at the table one morning with his daughters, and he noticed that they got the paper and they flicked through it, and they said to him, listen, he said to them, listen, why don't you ever read the paper? And they said, there's nothing in it for us, Dad, there's no rock and roll. And he went, oh, okay, I better get some music in the paper. So he walked into the office and he told me this story, and he looked around the room and he went, the guy with one eyebrow and pink hair, what does he actually do again? And suddenly I ended up writing about music, which was fantastic, because I loved it. And I got to hang out with guys like you, and we had lots of fun, didn't we? You know, we were just saying before how, you know, you and me, we were in our 20s, and we met like Duran Duran, who were in their 20s, and they were fresh-faced young boys who were going, wow. You know.
As Frank Zappa once said, most rock journalism is people who can't write interviewing people who can't talk for people who can't write. Pretty much sums us up, doesn't it, Paulie?
Absolutely, absolutely.
We get to the tragic part of the story where we almost lost you 15 years ago. Was that...
Yeah.
Was that, well, you say it was all self-inflicted. Was that self-inflicted from the journalism part of the career?
Well, I drank too much, and a group of guys that I used to hang out with, they all turned into massive junkies, you know, and they all loved Keith Richards, you know, and they all wanted to be Keith, you know, and so they got into the heroin, and I must admit, you know, a couple of times I tried it with them, you know, but if it was 20 times, I'd tell you, Paul, it was 20 times, but it was literally like 2 times I think I ever used a needle. And you say, well, why did you do that? And the worst thing is, you know, lying in the Austin hospital, you think, well, why did I do that? And you go, well, because I was pissed. And you think, you know, it's not much of an excuse, you know, to ruin your life because you were pissed. But yeah, I ended up getting Hep C, and and they said to me, you know, this is going to be a problem for you later in life. And I said to the doctor, oh, should I stop drinking? And he said, oh no, keep drinking, but drink light beer. And I went, oh, well, if I can drink light beer, I can drink anything, you know. But I must admit, you know, people say to me, oh, you drank a lot, you know, because you were in punk bands. And I go, no, 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 they're all pussycats. It was the journos, you know. Journos are by far worse, you know, they are. They're hardcore, the journos, you know.
Yeah, but here you are to
I
tell
mean,
the story.
we used to survive, you and me, on like, you know, opening at record launches, you know, they'd give you cheap champagne and, you know, spring rolls. And that was our diet, mate. For how many
For
years
about,
was that?
for about a decade, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. That's all we ate, you know.
Yeah.
Food, what's that? You know, but yeah, look, I did survive, and it was while I went into, you know, I had the liver problems that I met this woman in the waiting room at the Austin Hospital who ended up being this woman called Inga Glendini, who was one of Australia's most famous ever writers, you know. And she said, oh, why are you here, Paulie? And I said, oh, well, you know, I've got, you know, Hep C and I need a new liver. And she said, what do you do? And I said, well, I've been a bit of a journer. I've written a few songs. And she said, you should start writing down your old stories. It'll give you something to do because you're going to be spending a lot of time waiting around in this hospital and waiting around for stuff. And I went, oh, okay. So I did. And I just started. So this all started about 10 years ago, the book. That's where it all sort of happened. And it's sort of just been sitting there. But I suppose if there's anything that's good that's come out of COVID was that I was sitting at home with it, and I had a really good mate called Peter Wilson, who was a journo in, we started together on the same day at the Sun, and he was in London, but we spent November, December and January. He rang up every night and we did these Zooms like this, and we went through it line by line, and I gave him a big fat cow and he cut it down into a couple of sausages, you know, which is what you sort of need.
So that's the book. As much
Yeah.
as it's got highs and lows and it's a roller coaster and the ups and downs, the bit that I loved the most was finding out that Keith Richards knows the song Red Back on the Toilet Seat.
That is a true story. I had to interview Keith, and Paddy Donovan, who we both know, another journo, music journo, said, whatever you do, record it. And I went, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. And but on the day in question, I ended up minding my 5 nieces and my daughter, 6 kids under 5, and my 2 sisters said, it's your turn to mind them today. And I went, but I'm interviewing Keith. And they said, bad luck. And they just left me. And these kids just all started going berserk, and, you know, the phone rang and it was Keith, and I was really flustered, you know, and I sort of said, oh, you know, Keith, it's Paul from Australia, you know, what would you know about Australia anyway? And he did. He started singing down the line, there was a red back on the toilets. And he sang it, and I said, I can't believe you know that song. And he goes, come on, mate, everyone knows Slim Dusty, you know. This is Keith. And then he said, oh, I love, because I'd sort of taken the mickey out of him a bit, you know, he sort of he came back with, you know, I love playing in Melbourne because I can yell out, you know, show me your map of Tassie, and, you know, I really like Albury truck stops, you know, you get a good quality burger, you know. And he gave me all this gold, and I went, oh, you know, Keith's a professional, he knows what he's doing. But yeah, that was a classic, that one.
Well, good to talk to you, Paulie. There's the book for everybody.
Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate it, mate.
I look forward to when Tom Cruise plays you in the movie version.
Who's going to play you, though, in the movie, in the same movie? We'll get Brad Pitt, okay? No worries. Good on you, Paul. Keep on keeping on, mate.